What if a struggling veteran bought an old mountain lodge for $1 and discovered it was hiding the truth behind a Christmas tragedy buried for decades? What if the only one brave enough to lead him through the darkness was his loyal German Shepherd buddy, guiding him step by step toward a secret that an entire town feared to face? Tonight, you will walk beside Jake Harris as he turns sorrow into hope and transforms a forgotten lodge into a home where broken hearts learn to heal again. I hope you enjoy this story, filled with courage, redemption, and the quiet miracles of Christmas. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments below and subscribe. The winter sky pressed low over the outskirts of the city, a heavy gray blanket that muted sound and swallowed the last traces of daylight. Snow drifted slowly through the air and gathered in soft white layers along rooftops and empty streets. The wind carried a sharp cold that hinted at the coming Christmas season and wrapped the world in a brittle stillness. Jake Harris walked out of the warehouse just as the final shift whistle faded. He was a man of 40, with a lean frame shaped by years of military discipline. His shoulders were broad, though slightly slumped from fatigue. His face carried a rugged structure with a strong jaw and lines etched deep around his eyes. His short brown hair had begun to turn gray at the edges, and a trimmed beard framed his mouth, giving him an appearance both worn and resilient. His skin held the weathered tone of someone who had faced too many suns in distant deserts. He moved with a quiet steadiness a habit formed after years of surviving unpredictable terrain. Jake rarely spoke unless necessary. Those who worked with him saw him as polite but distant. They understood little about him except that he never called in sick and always finished his tasks, even when his hands trembled from exhaustion. As he stepped into the cold, his breath rose in pale clouds. His mind drifted back to the moments he wished he could forget. Nights in the Middle East, filled with smoke sand and distant explosions, the cries of comrades, the sudden flare of panic when a shadow moved the wrong way. Those memories had followed him home and clung to him with claws he could not loosen. Every night, he woke drenched in sweat, believing for a few seconds that he was still on the battlefield. His heart raced until he saw the small apartment ceiling above him and the warm shape of Buddy curled at his feet. Buddy was waiting for him now near the warehouse fence. The dog rose to his paws, tail lifting slightly at the sight of his human. Buddy was a 5-year-old German Shepherd with a thick coat of black tan and silver. His eyes were deep brown, steady, and alert. The kind of eyes that noticed every shift in body language and every tremor of breath. His posture was strong and confident, yet gentle when touching those he trusted. Jake had found him during his last year overseas, when a military unit rescued the pup from a collapsed building. Buddy had followed Jake since then, like a shadow of warmth in a life chilled by fear. The bond between them was silent but strong. Buddy walked beside Jake, now pressing close enough that their steps matched in rhythm. Jake crouched down and placed a tired hand on Buddy's head, feeling the warmth beneath the thick fur. Then he rose, shoulders heavy, as he started the long walk home to the small apartment he barely afforded. Snowflakes collected on his coat and melted into cold traces on his collar. He thought about the message his manager had given him earlier that day. Hours reduced. Company slowing for the holiday season. Nothing personal. Jake accepted the news with a nod, but inside, a weight had settled like a stone inside his chest. Rent was due in 2 weeks. His savings were already gone, absorbed by bills, and the slow bleed of trying to rebuild a life in a world that had moved on without him. When he reached the apartment, he climbed the narrow stairs and unlocked the creaking door. The interior was small and dim, with only a single lamp casting a weak amber glow. Buddy went straight to his usual corner, where an old blanket was folded. Jake removed his coat and sat on the edge of the bed, his elbows resting on his knees. His thoughts spiraled through worries, debts, and the crushing feeling that no matter how many hours he worked, the world kept pushing him down. The holiday cheer outside felt like a distant universe. Strings of lights blinked from balconies across the street, but did nothing to warm the cold knot inside him. Jake opened his laptop, hoping distraction might quiet the tension clawing at his ribcage. He scrolled through local job boards. Listings were few and mostly seasonal work that paid barely enough for groceries. The edges of his vision blurred from exhaustion. Buddy lifted his head, sensing the shift in Jake's breathing. The dog Rose padded softly across the room and nudged Jake's hand with his nose. That simple touch grounded him. Jake inhaled slowly, letting the trembling in his chest fade just enough to remain steady. When his eyes returned to the laptop screen, a small advertisement caught his attention. A property listing buried between used cars and old furniture. It read, "Snowbridge Mountain Lodge, $1 must sell." Jake stared for a long moment. He expected it to be a scam or a mistake, but the listing included a photograph of a small lodge resting on a snowy hillside. The building looked old, with worn wood siding and a sagging roof. Yet there was something quietly inviting about it, something lonely in a way that echoed his own state of being. The listing mentioned a remote town named Snowbridge, set in the northern mountains, a place small enough to vanish from most maps. Jake clicked through the description, noting that the lodge needed repairs and that the owner wanted it sold quickly. No mention of why. No mention of what happened to the previous occupants. Only a single strange line at the bottom that read, "A chance to start fresh." Jake leaned back, eyes fixed on the glow of the screen. His thoughts tangled. Could he leave this life behind? Could he trade the warehouse, his debts, his sleepless nights for a place that cost nothing more than a single dollar? It seemed absurd, yet the idea sparked a faint ember in his chest, a feeling he had not experienced in years. Possibility. Buddy placed his head on Jake's knee and watched him intently, as if urging him to keep reading. Jake reached down and stroked the dog's ears, thinking about the road they had walked together. Buddy was all he had left, and maybe Buddy deserved a place where the air smelled of pine instead of exhaust. A place where nights were quiet enough for healing instead of haunted by echoes of war. Jake opened the message form for the listing. His fingers hovered over the keyboard. He hesitated, breathing in through his nose, slow and steady. Taking this chance was reckless. But staying was a slow collapse. He typed his name and hit send. As the message confirmation appeared on the screen, he felt something shift inside him. Not hope exactly, but the first crack in the walls he had built around himself. Outside, the snow continued to fall. Cars passed below, leaving trails of light through the frosted window. Buddy settled beside him, pressing their warmth together against the cold winter outside. Jake exhaled, letting his eyes close for a moment as the weight of the day settled into a quiet stillness. He imagined the lodge on that snowy hillside in Snowbridge. Imagined standing on a porch with mountains rising silent around him. Imagined Buddy running through fresh snow instead of pacing a cramped apartment. It was not a plan, yet only a fragile dream. But for the first time in a long time, Jake felt his chest loosen just slightly, maybe enough to take the next step. He shut the laptop and rested his forehead in his hands. The world outside hummed with distant Christmas music and scattered laughter. Inside the apartment was dim and sparse, yet for one moment the air felt almost softer. He whispered a few quiet words to himself, unsure if they belonged to hope or desperation. Buddy curled at his feet, a steady presence, echoing loyalty, patience, and trust. Jake looked toward the window, where snowflakes swirled in the city light. He had reached the end of something he could no longer hold together. Maybe that was why the listing appeared when it did. Maybe life sometimes opened a narrow door when everything else closed. Jake placed his hand on Buddy's back, feeling the steady rhythm of the dog's breathing. Tomorrow he would learn more about Snowbridge. Tomorrow he would choose whether to stay in this failing life or gamble everything on a winter lodge that cost $1. For now, he sat in the soft hush of the room, letting the snow whisper against the glass. He was tired in a way deeper than muscles and bone. But somewhere beneath that exhaustion lay a quiet stirring. Fragile, but present. He did not name it. He simply let it remain as he leaned back, letting Buddy rest his head on his boot. The winter night wrapped around them, and Jake allowed himself to imagine that change might be possible. Snow drifted across the mountain road in long, sweeping ribbons as dusk approached. The sky was a deep blue that hinted at nightfall, and the cold air pressed hard against the windshield of the old truck. The world felt suspended in a quiet winter stillness, broken only by the steady hum of the engine and the rhythmic breathing of Buddy beside Jake. Jake Harris kept both hands firm on the wheel as he guided the aging truck through the narrow mountain pass. The headlights carved a pale tunnel through the gathering snow. His face looked even more worn in the faint glow. The sharp lines around his eyes deepened from lack of sleep, and the tight set of his mouth betrayed a strain he refused to voice. But beneath that fatigue was a thin thread of determination. He had chosen this road. He had chosen this lodge, this $1 chance to rebuild something that resembled a life. Buddy sat tall on the passenger seat, his ears twitching at every shift in the wind. His thick black tan and silver coat made him look almost like a living shadow against the dim interior of the truck. He scanned the surroundings with calm alertness, the way a seasoned guardian would. The dog sensed the tension in Jake as easily as he sensed the scent of snow. Every few minutes, Buddy leaned his head slightly toward Jake, as if to reassure him that they faced the long road together. As they descended into the valley, the first lights of Snowbridge appeared. The town was small, lined with narrow streets and wooden storefronts decorated for Christmas. Strings of gold, white, and red lights hung across the lampposts, and a large tree stood in the center square, glowing with ornaments that flickered like tiny embers. The scene should have been comforting. It should have carried the warmth of a holiday homecoming. But for Jake, it only reminded him of the distance between the world he saw and the one he felt inside. The cheerful displays did not quiet the ache in his chest or ease the worry of what awaited him at the lodge. When Jake drove down the main street, he noticed people glancing toward the truck with brief, polite nods. But when their eyes drifted past him toward the ridge where Evergreen Lodge stood, their expressions shifted. Some tightened their lips. Some looked away too quickly. A few whispered behind gloved hands. Jake felt a flicker of unease, but he forced his thoughts back to the road. He reminded himself that rumors and old buildings often walked hand in hand. Buddy shifted in his seat, emitting a low rumble in his throat, but Jake rested a hand on the dog's head, and the sound faded. They climbed the last snowy path and reached Evergreen Lodge. The building rose from the hillside like an old skeleton of timber and stone. The roof sagged in places, and long icicles hung beneath the eaves. Several windows were clouded with frost from the inside, and a few loose shutters clapped against the wall in the wind. The wooden porch creaked under Jake's boots when he stepped out. The air here was sharper colder and carried the faint scent of pine mixed with damp wood. Inside the lodge, the temperature dropped even further. Jake switched on the nearest light. A faint flicker passed through the bulb before it settled into a weak yellow glow. The walls were dry in some spots and damp in others. The floor groaned beneath every step. Yet despite the decay, there was a strange dignity in the building. It felt ancient, but not forgotten. Tired, but waiting. Jake stood for a moment, absorbing the weight of his new responsibility. He imagined what it could look like if repaired. A warm lodge on a snowy hill. A place where he and Buddy might rest without fear of eviction or unpaid bills. Buddy sniffed the air, then trotted ahead to inspect each room. His tail swayed low, not fearful, but cautious. Jake followed behind, moving through the main hall into a small kitchen where the counters were worn and the cabinets hung crooked. The living area had a stone fireplace, though the chimney looked clogged and the hearth was damp. Every corner seemed to echo with a long silence. Jake found an old toolbox left behind by a previous owner. With his calloused hands, he tightened loose hinges, repaired a sagging shelf, and patched a tear in a window frame using leftover boards. He worked without complaint. Hard labor was familiar and grounding. But with every nail he drove into the wood, a worry pulled at him. His savings were nearly gone. He had purchased enough food for himself and Buddy to last only a little while. If the lodge demanded more repairs than he could handle, he might not survive the winter here. That thought crawled under his skin, but he tried to shake it away. Night settled fast. The wind howled around the lodge, and snow brushed softly against the windows. Jake lit a small lamp and rolled out a thin sleeping bag in a corner of the main room. Buddy circled twice, then lay down beside him warm and steady, like a living shield against the cold. The air stung Jake's skin, even through his coat. His breath formed pale clouds as he tried to sleep. The silence of the lodge should have soothed him, but instead it pressed heavily over his chest. His thoughts wandered from debt to loneliness to the hope and fear tangled inside him. He reached out to rest a hand on Buddy's back, but before he touched the fur, Buddy jolted upright. The dog's ears pointed toward the hallway. His muscles tensed, his eyes fixed on something unseen. Jake sat up, heart thumping. He listened. The wind moaned outside, but inside the hall, a deeper quiet waited. Buddy stepped forward slowly, then let out a sharp bark that echoed through the wooden corridor. Jake felt the hairs rise on his arms. Buddy barked again, louder this time, urgent, not afraid, but insistent. Jake rose, grabbed the dim lamp, and followed Buddy down the hall. The floorboards creaked with every step. The air grew colder as they moved deeper into the corridor. Buddy stopped at the very last room, where a dry wreath hung on the door. The wreath was small, made of brittle pine needles and faded red berries. Its ribbon had lost its color. It looked as though it had been untouched for many winters. Buddy whined softly, then nudged the door with his nose. Jake felt a shiver run down his spine. He opened the door slowly, and the room beyond lay dark, silent, and strangely untouched. Something about the wreath lingered in his mind. A Christmas decoration on a door that should have been empty for years. Jake stood in the threshold, his breath shallow, Buddy pressed against his leg, waiting. The cold deepened around them, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Jake could not explain the feeling that wrapped around him, but he sensed that Buddy had led him here for a reason. The room did not speak, but it seemed to listen. Jake stepped back and closed the door quietly. He hardly slept after that. His thoughts drifted constantly to the wreath and to the soundless weight of the hallway. He lay beside Buddy, listening to the wind and feeling the pulse of uncertainty settle into his chest. Evergreen Lodge had welcomed him, but it had also whispered something he could not understand. For now, it was enough to know Buddy had sensed it first. And Jake trusted Buddy more than anything else in this world. Snow pressed softly against the old windows of Evergreen Lodge as dawn settled over the mountains. The sky outside was pale with the muted glow of winter light, and the cold seeped into every corner of the wooden walls. Inside the lodge, the air was still heavy with the unease of the previous night, and the strange tension that had lingered in the hallway seemed to follow Jake into the morning. Jake Harris woke with stiffness in his shoulders and fatigue clinging to his bones. His sleep had been shallow and broken. The memory of Buddy barking into the dark hallway remained vivid in his mind. He rubbed his face, letting the roughness of his palms ground him back into the present. The room was cold enough that his breath misted slightly, and Buddy lay beside him, curled into a tight shape for warmth. The dog lifted his head when Jake sat up, his deep brown eyes steady and aware, as if he had been waiting for Jake to rise. Jake rose, slowly, pulling on his worn jacket and stepping across the creaking floor. He tried to shake off the sense of being watched that had followed him since midnight. He reminded himself that buildings creaked and winter winds whispered, and that old lodges sometimes carried the weight of history in strange ways. But no matter how he reasoned it, something in his chest remained tense, like a knot refusing to loosen. Buddy stood and followed him close, pressing lightly against his leg for reassurance. Jake stroked the dog's head, grateful for the solid warmth beneath his fingers. The lodge might have been strange, but Buddy was constant, unwavering, and honest in every reaction he gave. That alone gave Jake enough steadiness to start the day. He lit a small lantern and made his way to the far rooms, hoping to continue small repairs. But before he could gather tools, Buddy froze in the doorway of the last room in the hall. His posture sharpened, his tail lowered, and his ears lifted high, as if he were listening to something Jake could not hear. Jake felt the familiar prickle rise along his spine. He stepped closer and placed a hand on Buddy's back. "What is it, Buddy?" he whispered, though his voice came out rough from fatigue. Buddy did not bark this time. Instead, he moved with slow, deliberate steps into the room. Jake followed, letting the dim lantern cast its weak glow across the floorboard's walls and the simple wooden bed frame pushed against the far wall. The bed looked untouched, but the air around it felt colder than the rest of the lodge. Buddy approached the bed, lowered his head, and sniffed along the side before pushing his nose beneath it. He let out a quiet, urgent whine and began to scratch at one of the floorboards beneath the frame. The sound was sharp against the silence. Jake crouched down beside him, the lantern trembling slightly in his grip. Something in Buddy's intensity told Jake this was not a reaction to simple curiosity. There was purpose in the way the dog scraped the wood. "All right, Buddy, I hear you." Jake murmured carefully, pulling the bed frame aside. He knelt down, examining the board Buddy had been focused on. It looked no different from the others, but when Jake pressed his fingers along its edge, he felt a slight give. A faint soft spot in the wood that did not match the rest of the floor. He exhaled slowly, steadying his breath, and pried the board up with the edge of his pocket tool. The wood lifted with a quiet crack, and beneath it lay a small tin box coated in dust and rust. It was rectangular, with faded paint that might once have been bright green, but now had dulled into a murky tone. Jake felt a subtle heaviness in his chest as he lifted it from its hiding place. Buddy sat beside him, watching intently, ears tilted forward. Jake rested the tin box on his knee and opened the fragile latch. Inside lay a few small Christmas ornaments, a tiny wooden angel with chipped wings, a silver bell tarnished with age, and a strip of ribbon folded carefully, though its color had almost faded away. Beneath the ornaments was a single letter, folded many times, and edges curled from age. The paper was yellowed soft and delicate to the touch. Jake unfolded it carefully, his fingers almost trembling. The handwriting inside was small and slightly uneven, as though written by a child learning patience. At the top, he saw a name. Emily. The sight of the name alone made Jake pause. Something about the softness of the letters stirred an ache he could not quite explain. He began to read. Emily wrote about her father, who worked at the coal mine near Snowbridge. She described him as tall, with a kind laugh, and rough hands that smelled of earth and pine. She wrote about the night he did not come home. She wrote about the other men who went missing that same Christmas Eve, swallowed by the mine, while the town was told it was only a tragic accident caused by a collapse. But in the letter, she confessed her belief that it was not an accident at all. She wrote that her father had whispered fears of unsafe tunnels and warnings he heard from others. She wrote that people in charge had ignored concerns and silenced questions. Jake's breath tightened as he absorbed each line. Emily had written this with hope that someone someday might find her words. The innocence in her tone weighed heavily against the grimness of the story she shared. Jake read slowly and carefully, letting the voice of the child settle into his thoughts. Her words carried a quiet pain buried beneath years of snow and silence. When he reached the final lines, his hands trembled slightly. Emily wrote that she missed her father every Christmas. She wrote that she left her small ornaments as reminders for him, hoping he would find them someday. And she wrote that if anyone ever discovered her letter, she wished that they would not let the truth be forgotten. Jake folded the letter gently, unable to shake the tightness in his chest. He felt Buddy move closer, pressing his head lightly onto Jake's leg. The warmth of the dog offered comfort, but could not erase the sorrow that filled the room. Jake rested a hand on Buddy's fur, grateful for the grounding presence. Buddy's eyes seemed to hold a depth of understanding that Jake could not explain. Jake stared at the tin box, then at the floorboard where Buddy had dug. Behind the festive lights of Snowbridge and the gentle snowfall that covered the rooftops lay a history shaped by loss and unanswered pain. The weight of that truth settled into Jake's heart with the same heaviness as winter snow pressing against the windows. Though he said nothing aloud, Jake felt a shift inside him. He had come to this lodge for a chance at rebuilding his life, but now he realized he might have stepped into a story much larger than himself. Buddy's quiet gaze confirmed it. The dog had led him here with certainty as though guided by something deeper than instinct. Jake placed the tin box on the bed and exhaled slowly. He did not know what to do next, or why this letter had been hidden for so long. But he understood that the silence around this truth had lasted far too many winters. And now that he held Emily's words in his hands, he could not ignore them. For that moment, he sat still in the dim glow of the lantern, Buddy leaning against him, and the soft whisper of snow outside the window. The letter had opened a door into the past, and Jake felt himself standing at the threshold with the weight of a child's hope resting gently in his palms. A thin layer of snow covered the roads of Snowbridge as morning light pushed gently over the mountains. The air was sharp and carried the scent of pine and distant chimney smoke. Frost clung to the edges of windows and rooftops, giving the small town a quiet sparkle that contrasted with the heaviness in Jake's thoughts as he prepared to leave Evergreen Lodge. Jake Harris stepped out into the cold, pulling his jacket tight around his shoulders. His breath drifted in pale clouds, and his footsteps cracked lightly over frozen snow. Buddy trotted close beside him, the dog's fur holding flakes of white that glimmered in the early light. Buddy's posture was alert, his ears twitching as he scanned the quiet surroundings. It was clear he sensed Jake's tension and stayed closer than usual. Jake carried the tin box in his bag, the letter from Emily, placed carefully inside. He felt the weight of it, not just against his side, but inside his chest. The words of the girl stayed with him like a distant echo. He needed answers, or at least signs that the truth had not been buried completely. That hope, no matter how small, led him toward the town library. The Snowbridge Library stood at the edge of the main street, a small wooden building, painted white with green trim. A sign above the door hung slightly crooked, its paint chipped but still legible. Inside, the air was warm and smelled of old pages and pine cleaner. Wooden shelves filled the room, and soft light filtered through tall frosted windows. Behind the counter stood the librarian, a woman in her late 50s named Marjorie. She had a narrow face, with pale skin, lightly lined from years of concentration. Her gray hair was pulled into a tight bun at the back of her head, and she wore a thick cardigan in muted blue. Her expression was reserved, cautious, even as she offered a polite nod. "Morning," he said, his voice low. "I am looking for old newspaper records, anything from the years around the mining accident." The moment he mentioned the mine, her expression tightened. Her gaze flicked toward the door, then back at him. She hesitated before responding, and her voice grew softer. "Newspapers from that time are not available anymore," she said. "They were lost during a basement flood many years ago." She adjusted a stack of books, though they did not need adjusting. "We do not keep much from those years." Jake watched her carefully. Her words came too quickly, and her hands moved with a stiffness that betrayed discomfort. He sensed she wanted him to leave the topic alone. The evasiveness stirred something uneasy inside him. "Are you sure there is nothing at all?" he asked. "Even a record list or archived copies?" Marjorie avoided his eyes and shook her head once. "Best to focus on the present," she murmured. "Some things are better left where they are." Before Jake could question further, the front door opened and cold air swept into the library. A tall, broad-shouldered man stepped in, letting the door slam lightly behind him. He wore a dark, winter uniform with the badge of the Snowbridge deputy on his chest. His face was angular, with a square jaw and thick eyebrows. A short, trimmed beard darkened his chin and framed a mouth set into a firm line. His skin was ruddy from years outdoors, and his eyes, a cool steel gray, watched Jake with a distrust that felt immediate and personal. This was Deputy Mark Collins, known around town for his stern presence and quick judgments. His voice carried authority, shaped by the pressure of keeping a small, isolated community in order. "You must be the new owner of Evergreen Lodge," he said, stepping closer. He did not smile. "Word travels fast here. People say you have been asking questions about old matters." Jake straightened his back, though he kept his tone steady. "I found something at the lodge that made me concerned. I am trying to understand what happened in the past." Deputy Collins studied him for a long moment, and the air seemed to thicken between them. Then he spoke again, his voice low, but edged with warning. "If you want advice, focus on fixing that lodge. Do not stir up old tragedies. They do not need revisiting, and outsiders asking questions do not tend to fit in well here." Buddy let out a soft growl under his breath, barely audible, but sharp enough to make Collins glance down. The deputy raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. He turned and walked toward the door, leaving behind a trail of cold tension. Marjorie whispered, without looking up, "It is best not to upset him, or anyone about that matter." Jake left the library with a deeper sense of unease. Snowbridge looked peaceful from the outside, but beneath the Christmas wreaths and lights, there seemed to be fear, threaded through the town like old roots. Buddy walked at his side, his tail low, his eyes sweeping across every sound and movement. When Jake reached the parking area, his stomach tightened. One of the truck's tires slumped against the ground, the rubber cut open by clean, deliberate slashes. Cold wind swept over him, biting through his jacket. He crouched next to the tire, brushing away snow. His fingers stung as he touched the damaged rubber. His breath came out in a sharp cloud of frustration and worry. He did not have money for a replacement tire. Not now. Not after using most of his savings for food and basic supplies. He looked around, but the street was empty, the sound of distant bells and holiday music drifting faintly from the town square. Buddy pressed close, licking Jake's chilled hand, then turning his gaze down the empty road. His gentle touch grounded Jake, reminding him he was not entirely alone. Jake exhaled slowly, then began patching the tire as best he could with the small repair kit he had. His hands shook slightly from the cold, but he kept going, working slowly, carefully, until the rubber held enough for the truck to move. As he worked, snow settled on his shoulders, and Buddy kept watch, standing guard with a protective posture. Every now and then, the dog growled softly, as if sensing something that Jake could not see. When the repair was finished, Jake rose, stretching his stiff fingers. His body trembled from the cold and effort. He climbed into the truck, preparing to head back to Evergreen Lodge, when he heard a soft voice behind him. "Excuse me, dear." Jake turned to see an elderly woman standing near the walkway. She was small and bundled in a heavy red coat. Her face was deeply lined, but her eyes were warm and wise with a gentle brown color. Wisps of silver hair framed her cheeks, and she carried a tin wrapped in cloth. She smiled kindly. "My name is Beatrice," she said. "I live near your lodge. I saw you were struggling a bit." She held out the tin with steady hands. "Some Christmas cookies." A small welcome. Jake accepted it with quiet gratitude. "Thank you, Mom." Beatrice leaned in slightly, her voice dropping to a whisper. Evergreen Lodge and the old mine were once the heart of this town. Christmas meant something different back then, but greed changed everything. That night, became a shadow we all pretend not to see. Her eyes held a sadness that went beyond words, and she patted Jake's arm gently before turning to leave. Jake watched her walk away, her figure slowly fading into the falling snow. As he drove back toward the lodge, Buddy rested his head against Jake's shoulder, offering silent support. Jake felt the weight of the day settle heavily within him. The town was fearful, the past was buried, and someone wanted to keep it that way. But Jake knew one thing for certain. He could no longer pretend the truth was not calling to him. Emily's letter had opened a wound that demanded answers, and the cold whisper of the mountains seemed to push him forward into the heart of a story no one in Snowbridge wanted told. Snowbridge lay under a heavy gray sky as afternoon faded into a pale, quiet light. The cold deepened with each hour, and the wind carried fine flakes of ice that drifted across the ground like soft whispers. Behind Evergreen Lodge, the trees stood bare and motionless, their branches stiff with frost. The air was so still that every sound seemed to echo against the hills. Jake Harris stepped out the back door of the lodge, pulling his coat tighter around him. His breath formed steady clouds in the freezing air, and his boots crunched softly over the snow. He felt the weight of Emily's letter heavy in his pocket, though he had not looked at it since dawn. Something inside him urged him to act, to find the truth that seemed buried beneath every shadow in this town. Yet another part of him whispered caution. He had already seen enough to know the past here was dangerous. Buddy trotted at his side, leaving deep paw prints behind them. The dog moved with purpose, nose close to the ground, tail low but steady. His fur caught bits of drifting snow, and his breath puffed in gentle clouds. Jake watched him closely, noticing how Buddy kept glancing toward the woods, as if following a faint signal only he could sense. After a few moments, Buddy paused, then looked back at Jake, with an expression that carried urgency without fear. "What do you smell, Buddy?" Jake murmured, though he knew Buddy did not need the question. The dog turned and began walking toward a narrow trail, hidden behind a cluster of pine trees. Snow almost covered the path, making it look like no one had stepped there for years. Jake hesitated, but the determined posture of Buddy pushed him forward. They followed the trail until the woods opened slightly, revealing a mound of stones and rotting timber, partially buried by snow. At first glance, it looked like an old root cellar or collapsed shed. But as Jake brushed away the snow, he saw the outline of a rusted metal door, lying half open, its hinges broken and bent from time. A faint draft rose from the opening, carrying the smell of cold earth and something older. Buddy sniffed at the door, then stepped back, pawing at it with insistence. Jake knelt and pulled the door fully open, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. The steps were slick with ice and dirt, and the air that drifted out felt colder than the mountain wind above. He felt a pressure building in his chest, a mixture of fear and resolve. Buddy moved to the top of the stairs and waited, looking back at Jake with steady, trusting eyes. "All right, Buddy," Jake whispered. "We go slow." They descended the stairs, each step groaning softly under Jake's weight. The lantern he carried cast a pale circle of light ahead of them, revealing thick stone walls. The tunnel stretched long and narrow, leading deeper beneath the hillside. Dust floated in the air, and the silence felt complete, as though the world above had vanished. Buddy walked ahead, but stayed close, checking every corner before moving on. His body was tense yet controlled. Jake followed carefully, running his fingers once along the stone as if reading the hidden years carved into them. His pulse thudded in his ears, but he kept moving. Something in him knew they were getting closer to the truth Emily had tried to preserve. The tunnel narrowed, then widened into a colder chamber where frost clung to the stones. Buddy stopped abruptly, his ears rising, his posture sharp. He emitted a soft whine, almost mournful, and placed one paw against the wall. Then he began scratching, not wildly, but with focused urgency, pressing at the stones as if he sensed something trapped behind them. Jake raised the lantern. The wall in front of them was made of older stone blocks, some misaligned from age. He placed a hand on one of the looser blocks and felt a faint hollow behind it. His breath caught. He removed the pack from his shoulder and took out a small crowbar he had brought without thinking. Perhaps instinct had guided him the same way Buddy had. He wedged the tool into a crack and pushed. Stone shifted grudgingly, then fell with a dull thud. Behind it, darkness opened into a small cavity carved into the wall itself. Inside lay a single metal box covered with thick dust and flecks of rust. Jake lifted it out carefully, surprised by its weight. Buddy stepped closer, lowering his head to inspect it with calm seriousness. Jake opened the box slowly. Inside lay stacks of old papers, brittle at the edges. There were ledgers with neat columns of numbers maps marked with routes leading through the mining tunnels, and folded documents stamped with company insignia. As Jake lifted each page, the story became clearer. He found records of chemical deliveries, amounts far beyond normal operation. Notes about hazardous waste moved into abandoned shafts. Payments listed to various local officials, all written in the same crisp handwriting. And there on several forms sat the signature of the current mayor. The lines of the signature bold and confident, as though no wrong could ever catch up to him. Jake felt the cold deepen inside him as he realized the weight of the evidence he held. The so-called accident had been a lie built on greed and disregard for the workers who trusted the mine. He imagined Emily's father signing in for his last shift, unaware of the danger creeping through the tunnels. He imagined children waiting at home for a father who never returned. Buddy nudged Jake's arm with gentle pressure. Jake looked down, meeting Buddy's eyes. The dog's gaze held an almost human depth, reminding Jake that this truth was not just a chain of papers and numbers. It was about families who waited for answers in houses decorated with stockings and wreaths. Children who never stopped hoping. The thought cut through him with a quiet ache. Jake folded the papers carefully and returned them to the box, then held it firmly against his chest. He felt a shift inside him, a heavy sense of responsibility settling deeper than before. This was no longer a question of curiosity or coincidence. It was a truth hidden beneath years of silence, and now that he had found it, he could not ignore it. They climbed back up the stairs into the fading daylight. Snowflakes drifted down lightly around them, and Buddy walked close, pressing against Jake for warmth. Jake glanced once more toward the woods, knowing that the tunnel behind them held the first real proof of the story Emily had tried to leave behind. He did not know what the next step would be, but he knew the path ahead had changed. And as he looked at Buddy, he felt the dog's calm, steady presence supporting him, reminding him that they would face whatever came together. Evening settled slowly over Snowbridge as a thin veil of snowfall drifted across the rooftops. The sky held a gentle blue tint, and the last rays of daylight faded behind the pine-covered hills. The cold was steady, sharp, and quiet, and a soft glow from the distant town square, pulsed like a heartbeat of Christmas hope against the surrounding darkness. Jake Harris stood outside Evergreen Lodge, breathing in the cold air before turning back inside. His body ached from the long hours spent repairing the old furnace, and his hands were raw from gripping tools in the freezing wind. Buddy walked beside him, his fur dusted with snow, and his eyes alert to every sound drifting through the silent evening. Jake felt a growing weight in his chest, a mix of fear and responsibility. The documents from the mine lay hidden in his room upstairs, and every time he thought of them, his heart tightened. The truth he had uncovered was no longer a private burden. It was something that demanded to be heard. Earlier that morning, Jake had walked with Buddy through the snowy streets to the home of Beatrice. The elderly woman opened the door with a shiver of cold air swirling around her. Her face lined with age held a quiet strength, and her gray-blue eyes were calm despite the winter wind. She wore a wool shawl around her shoulders, and her silver hair was pulled into a neat bun. She looked at Jake for a long moment, the kind of look that measured a soul rather than a face. Jake told her everything. He described the tunnel, the rusted door, the metal box, and the records of chemical dumping and bribes. Beatrice listened without interrupting, her hands folded gently in her lap. Though her expression remained calm, Jake noticed the faint trembling in her fingers as though the truth settled heavily on her. When he finished, she closed her eyes briefly, as if offering a silent prayer. Beatrice then led him to the old church near the center of town. A tall, weathered building with thick wooden beams and a bell tower that leaned slightly with age. Inside, it smelled of pine and candle wax. At the front knelt an elderly minister named Father Samuel. He rose slowly as they approached. He was a thin man in his 70s, with a long white beard and deep-set eyes that carried decades of sorrow and compassion. His voice was soft and steady, and his movements careful, as though he had grown used to carrying the grief of others. Jake repeated his story, while Father Samuel listened with a quiet intensity. The old man touched the papers gently, as if they were fragile artifacts from another life. He nodded slowly, taking in every detail, his breath steady, despite the weight of what he heard. Jake saw a flicker of pain cross the minister's face, and knew that this truth reached deeper than he expected. Father Samuel whispered that some wounds never healed because they had never been allowed to be seen. Beatrice insisted that Jake speak with a local reporter who had once written stories about veterans and their struggles. Her name was Lydia Carter. She was a woman in her mid-30s with short auburn hair, fair skin, and green eyes sharp with curiosity. She carried herself with confidence, but Jake sensed a quiet gentleness beneath her professional edge. Lydia arrived bundled in a thick coat and knitted scarf, her cheeks flushed from the cold. She listened closely as Jake showed her the evidence, her expression growing tighter with every page. When she asked questions, they were careful, thoughtful, and kind. She told him she had long suspected the town was hiding something, but had never been able to prove it. Jake saw determination ignite in her eyes, like a flame catching dry wood. Word began to spread, though Jake had not spoken to anyone else. Families whispered behind closed doors, voices trembling with a mixture of fear and long-buried grief. The truth had slept under the snow for years, and now it rose like a ghost called back into the world. Jake felt the weight of that awakening pressing on his shoulders, and yet he also felt a flicker of hope. The kind of hope that comes not from light, but from people finding the courage to face the darkness. That evening, Jake and Buddy worked on the old furnace in the back room of the lodge. The pipes rattled loudly, the metal groaning from rust and cold. Jake knelt on the floor, tightening bolts and adjusting the connections. Buddy lay nearby, but kept lifting his head every few moments, ears pricked, as if sensing something outside. Jake wiped sweat from his forehead, though the air was freezing. His mind replayed the day, over and over, and each time fear rose like a tide. He worried for the people who might suffer for speaking, and for the dog who trusted him more than anyone in the world. He worried for what might happen once the truth reached those who feared it. Buddy suddenly stood, his posture stiffened, tail low and steady. He walked to the window and stared out into the falling snow. Jake followed him, gripping the window frame as he leaned forward to see what Buddy had sensed. Outside in front of Evergreen Lodge stood a single person. A woman bundled in a winter coat, holding a lit candle cupped in her hands. The flame flickered in the icy wind, yet did not go out. Jake recognized her as the mother of a miner whose name had appeared in the records. She stood motionless, eyes fixed on the lodge. Then another person arrived, and another. Soon a small group formed, each carrying a candle shielded by gloved hands. Their breath rose in clouds, and their bodies shivered, but they stood firmly. The glow of their candles cut through the pale snowfall, like threads of gold weaving through the darkness. Their faces were quiet but resolute, the kind of silence born from years of being afraid to speak. Jake felt his breath catch. He felt Buddy press against his leg, warm and steady. The weight in Jake's chest shifted, becoming something softer and heavier at the same time. He opened the door and stepped outside, letting the cold air wash over him. The wind carried the gentle hum of the town's distant Christmas lights, and the snow reflected the faint golden glow of the candles. The line of people grew, stretching along the front of the lodge. No one spoke. They stood together, trembling in the cold, holding their flames like fragile prayers. In that moment, Jake understood that the truth belonged not only to him or to Emily, but to every family who had waited in silence for answers. The candles flickered brighter against the snowy ground, like the first lights of a Christmas vigil long overdue. He whispered a quiet promise to himself and to the people gathered there. He would not let the truth fade again. Snowbridge lay beneath a restless Christmas Eve sky. Heavy clouds rolled low over the mountains, and thick snow whirled in wide circles as the wind pushed through the narrow streets. The air was sharp and biting, and the distant pine trees bent under the weight of the storm. Darkness settled early that night, turning the world into a cold white blur, broken only by the glow of porch lights flickering like trembling stars. Inside Evergreen Lodge, Jake Harris struggled to focus on the loose bolts and rusted pipes of the furnace, but his mind kept drifting back to the gathering of candlelight that had formed outside the night before. Buddy paced restlessly near the door, his ears twitching at every shift of the wind. The loyal German shepherd looked uneasy, as if sensing a threat moving beneath the storm. Jake knelt beside him and placed a hand on the thick, warm fur. The dog leaned into him, but his eyes remained fixed on the window. Jake felt a growing tension inside him, a silent warning that something was happening beyond the reach of the lodge walls. When Buddy suddenly stiffened and growled low in his throat, Jake knew the moment had come. The dog bolted toward the door, scratching urgently and whining for Jake to follow. Without hesitation, Jake grabbed his coat and flashlight and stepped into the storm with Buddy bounding ahead. The wind struck him hard and snow stung his face, but Buddy pushed forward nose to the ground, tracking something with absolute certainty. The dog led Jake toward the forest path behind the lodge, the same route that wound toward the abandoned mine. The wind carried a sharp scent, and Jake recognized it instantly. Gasoline. His breath tightened. Someone was out there planning to destroy the tunnels and every piece of evidence buried within. Buddy barked sharply and accelerated, forcing Jake to run through the deepening snow. His boots slipped on patches of ice, and the cold bit through his coat, but he kept moving. Memories of past battles surged through him, the heavy breath of danger, the knowledge that hesitation could cost lives. His chest ached, but he pushed on, following the only creature he trusted more than himself. Near the old entrance of the mine, Buddy slowed and growled low. Jake crouched beside him, scanning the dark stretch of tunnel. He saw faint shadows at the far end, the silhouettes of men moving quickly. One of them held a metal canister, and Jake's stomach twisted. He recognized the outline of the can. Gasoline. They were preparing to burn the evidence to seal the truth forever beneath smoke and ash. Buddy barked again, and his voice echoed through the stone corridor. The sound startled the men. One turned sharply, and the beam of his flashlight cut across the tunnel, illuminating his face. It was the mayor. His expression was wild and strained, his neatly combed hair now matted by the storm. Behind him stood two men with nervous eyes and trembling hands. They were younger and rougher looking, with heavy coats and chins marked by stubble. Jake felt fury rise like fire in his chest. Another sound broke through the chaos. A small gasp. Jake looked toward the left wall of the tunnel. A teenage boy stood there shivering with a camera held tightly to his chest. He looked about 15, with dark curly hair, pale skin, and wide, frightened eyes. He wore a thin jacket far too light for the storm. Jake recognized him as a kid who often skated in the town square. The boy had likely followed out of curiosity, hoping to record something dramatic for the internet without understanding the danger. A sudden crack thundered through the cavern. One of the wooden support beams split under the pressure of age and moisture. It snapped with a violent shudder and fell toward the boy. Jake's voice caught in his throat, but he had no time to move. Buddy did. The German shepherd launched himself forward with incredible speed, slamming into the boy's side and knocking him out of the collapse path. The beam crashed to the ground, sending a shock wave of dust and splinters across the tunnel. The boy landed hard but safe. Buddy stood over him, trembling from the impact, but still growling at the advancing men. Jake's heart pounded with fear and pride. His dog had saved another life without hesitation. One of the mayor's hired men rushed toward the fallen beam, with the gasoline canister raised, as if ready to ignite the explosion. Jake charged at him, driven by instinct and rage. They collided violently, grappling in the snow and dirt. The man smelled of sweat, and fuel, his breath quick and scared. Jake wrenched the canister from his hand and shoved him back. The man fell into the slush, gripping his wrist in pain. The mayor shouted something, but his voice cracked under the weight of fear. Jake stood tall, breathing hard, the canister held in one hand, his eyes locked on the man responsible for so much suffering. The mayor stumbled backward, his face ghostly pale. He fumbled with a lighter in his trembling fingers, unable to steady his hands. Before Jake could move further, sirens erupted above ground. Their sharp rising wail filled the forest, the sound echoing across the snowy hills. Red and blue lights flashed at the mine entrance, painting the tunnel walls in pulsing color. Buddy barked in response, and the boy dragged himself backward, eyes wide. State police officers stormed the tunnel. At their front was the local reporter, Lydia, her face fierce and determined. Behind her walked Father Samuel, holding a lantern that glowed warmly in the cold darkness. The officers raised their flashlights and weapons, ordering the men to freeze. The hired men immediately raised their hands, trembling. The mayor did not. He stared at the officers like a man whose last illusion had shattered. His lighter slipped from his hand and clattered across the stone floor. One of the officers stepped forward and placed him under arrest. Behind the police line, Lydia lifted her camera, capturing the mayor's face clearly. His guilt was no longer a rumor. It was recorded truth. Father Samuel began to pray softly, his voice echoing through the erupting chaos. The sound of his words mixed with the distant hum of Christmas hymns rising from the town above. Snow drifted into the entrance of the mine, carried by the wind, like falling ashes now cleansed of their fire. Jake knelt beside Buddy and wrapped his arms around the dog's warm neck. Buddy pressed his head into Jake's chest, panting hard, but alive and proud. The boy looked at them with tears in his eyes, whispering a shaky thank you. The truth had survived the night. The lies that had haunted Snowbridge for years crumbled into the cold earth. And as the sirens faded into the storm, the first distant bells of Christmas began to ring. A gentle snowfall drifted across Snowbridge as the new winter sunrise spread pale light over the mountains. The sky carried a soft silver glow, and the air was calm and crisp. Christmas was only a day away, and the town felt lighter than it had in many years. The weight of old secrets had lifted, leaving space for something warmer to grow. Evergreen Lodge stood proudly at the edge of the hill, no longer the broken, quiet building Jake Harris had once stepped into with trembling hope. It had been transformed through months of steady work and the funds recovered from the corrupt mining company. Fresh wooden beams replaced the rotted supports. The windows, once cracked or boarded, were now clear and shining. Warm yellow lights glowed from every room, and a tall evergreen tree, decorated with handmade ornaments, stood outside the entrance, where snow gathered softly around its base. Jake walked across the porch, carrying a tray of freshly baked cookies. His face looked different than it had a year before. The deep shadows beneath his eyes had faded, and the lines around his mouth no longer carried constant strain. He still bore the scars of war and loss, but the edge of grief had softened. Behind him, Buddy trotted proudly, with a bright red scarf around his neck. The German Shepherd was now 5 years old, strong and confident, his fur thick and brushed clean. His eyes reflected the calm joy of a dog who had finally found a safe home. Evergreen Home for Veterans and Rescue Dogs had opened only days before Christmas. Jake oversaw every detail. The lodge now offered warm rooms for veterans struggling with homelessness and trauma. Many carried wounds hidden behind tired eyes and hands that trembled when they thought no one was watching. Rescue dogs lived with them, forming quiet bonds that healed the parts of themselves they had forgotten. Jake understood their silence. He lived in it once. Now he helped them break through it. Inside the main hall, a small group gathered around the fireplace. A veteran named Marcus sat quietly stroking the ears of a hound mix, rescued from a nearby shelter. Marcus was a tall man in his late 40s, with dark skin, a neatly trimmed beard, and deep brown eyes. His posture was stiff at times, as though bracing for memories that threatened to surface. But when he looked at the dog in his arms, A gentle warmth broke through his guarded expression. Nearby, a woman named Helen arranged blankets on a wooden bench. She was in her 50s, with shoulder-length gray hair and light green eyes that carried both sorrow and strength. She had served in the Navy years ago and still walked with a slight limp from an old injury. She had spoken little when she first arrived, but Buddy had approached her slowly, tail wagging until she knelt down and let him rest his head in her lap. That was the moment her eyes softened for the first time since she entered the lodge. Jake checked the decorations one last time and stepped outside into the crisp air. Families from Snowbridge had begun to arrive, bringing warm food cookies and small wrapped gifts. Some were parents of the miners who had died years ago. Others were neighbors who had grown tired of the silence and too fearful to speak the truth until Jake and Buddy uncovered it. Now they gathered, with expressions of quiet peace and gratitude. Children ran across the snowy yard, laughing as they chased Buddy, who barked cheerfully and bounded through the snow with surprising speed. His red scarf fluttered in the wind, and each time he circled back to Jake, he pressed his head into Jake's hand as if reminding him that they shared everything that had brought them here. Jake felt a deep warmth in his chest. He remembered the nights he had stood alone in the darkness of the old lodge, unsure if he could survive another winter. He remembered the lonely ache that had clung to him after returning from war. He remembered the desperate moment he had bought the lodge for $1 because he had nothing left to lose. Now the same building was alive with light and voices and hope. The transformation felt almost unreal, and yet it was the most honest moment of his life. Beatrice arrived holding a tray of cinnamon bread wrapped in red cloth. Her silver hair shined against the snowy backdrop, and her cheeks were pink from the cold. She smiled at Jake with a warmth that reminded him of family he once knew. Father Samuel followed slowly behind her, leaning on a wooden cane carved with tiny stars. His white beard fluttered in the breeze. He paused to look at the glowing lodge, and his eyes shined with quiet pride. Lydia the reporter stood nearby, capturing the scene with her camera, her auburn hair tucked under a wool hat. She had changed too. Her eyes no longer held the weariness of a woman fighting alone. She looked lighter, more certain, more hopeful. Jake joined them and handed Beatrice a cookie. Buddy sat at his feet, tail sweeping the snow. Jake saw the faces of the families gathered around the tree. He saw the children decorating the lower branches with bright red ribbons. He saw the veterans standing close to one another as they sipped warm drinks shared by the townspeople. He saw the dogs nuzzling hands and legs, eager to give comfort. A soft bell tone drifted across the valley. The church bells began to ring, welcoming Christmas Eve. Snowflakes fell slowly, swirling gently around the lodge and gathering atop Buddy's head. The dog shook them off with a sneeze, causing several children to laugh and ask if they could pet him. Jake nodded, and Buddy stayed still, while small hands buried themselves in his thick fur. The warmth of the moment settled deep in Jake's heart. For the first time in many years, he felt whole. The world had taken much from him, but somehow life had brought him here to this porch, to this night, to this purpose. He watched the lights on the tree flicker softly and listened to the laughter that rose through the cold air. Hope had returned to Snowbridge and found a home in Evergreen Lodge. As night settled fully and the sky darkened to deep blue, the sound of the bells continued to echo gently. Snowbridge no longer whispered about the tragedy buried beneath years of fear. Instead, the town now spoke of the man and the dog, who found truth in the shadows and carried it into the light. Jake stood beside Buddy, the loyal friend who had walked with him through every hardship. The German shepherd pressed close to him, and Jake placed a steady hand on the dog's neck. The lanterns glowed, the snow fell, the tree lights twinkled, and for the first time in a long time, Jake felt ready to embrace the world again. Christmas had come not only to the town, but to his heart. In the quiet glow of that renewed Christmas, Jake and Buddy discovered something deeper than justice. They found the quiet truth that healing does not come from forgetting the past, but from reshaping it with compassion, courage, and community. Evergreen Lodge became a place where broken stories were lifted back into the light and where people learned again that hope grows strongest in the coldest winters. Their journey reminds us that miracles rarely arrive with thunder. They appear in small, faithful steps, in a loyal dog guiding his friend, in a town choosing truth instead of silence, in the steady warmth of hands reaching out to help one another. It is a gentle reminder that God often works through ordinary hearts to bring extraordinary healing. As you carry this story into your own days, may you find strength in hope and comfort in knowing you are never alone. If this journey touched your heart, please share it, leave a comment, and subscribe so more people can feel encouraged. And may the Lord bless you, keep you safe, and guide you with His light in every season of your life.